and welcome to the Rainbow Umbrella, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything under the rainbow.
Keen listeners may have noticed that there has been a bit of a theme the last couple of months here at the Rainbow Umbrella. I'm in no way aiming to make this a true crime podcast and will continue to talk about anything and everything that interests me and my listeners. But apart from being interesting, I feel talking about true crime is important for a number of reasons, not least of which is remembering and paying tribute to the victims and survivors of these horrific events. More than that though, it is important to pay attention to and understand the way in which these events are discussed, why they are discussed, and what it means to discuss them in the way that we do. And that is the focus of this episode. I'm once again joined by Rebecca Stringer, now Associate Professor Rebecca Stringer, who believes as I do that this kōrero is important for all those who are interested in and engage with true crime stories, whether historical or contemporary. Welcome back, Rebecca. I think you have now just become my most frequent guest, and congratulations on the promotion.
Well, thank you so much, and it's awesome to be back. I think this is a really key topic, given that true crime is on the rise.
Yes. So firstly, can you give a brief summary of the Me Too movement and what it means to be in a post-Me Too space so that we can orient our listeners in the space that we're discussing?
Yes, because there are those arguing that, you know, we're seeing this rise of true crime and at the same time it's being changed. The way true crime is talked about is being changed by the Me Too movement. So, you know, the Me Too movement, people would generally be familiar with October 2017. So the version of Me Too that was really all about kind of disclosing digitally and collectively experiences of sexual violence, so that basically the idea was to demonstrate the enormity of the problem. Now that's kind of the Alyssa Milano initiated moment of Me Too. And of course, one of the things that she was doing there was picking up that phrase Me Too that was already in circulation. So they were actually making a documentary at the time about Tarana Burke. And so Tarana Burke, who is a community, you would say sort of somebody who does social work and community work. So she's a community builder and she builds resources for communities that need them. And so what she perceived is that the kind of rape crisis culture in the US was really not something that women of colour were turning to. She saw the need for an alternative, and she placed particular value on a kind of, a moment in which someone might disclose and then the person in front of them says, hey, me too. So it's not disclosing to an expert to have your head read. It's actually about forming solidarity and through in that moment of solidarity beginning a process of recovery. And so for Tarana Burke, she was really about setting up community resources, creating a space in which disclosures and recovery could take place. And, they were making a documentary about the amazing work that she was doing, largely in Alabama from memory. So she's looking at the South. She was based in the South at this time. She's actually a New Yorker, but she was based in the South at this time. And so she'd been doing this since sort of the mid-2000s. And then Alyssa Milano, I think, had a sense of this phrase, Me Too, and this kind of use of it because that documentary was made. So she kind of grabs the concept and, of course, turned it into a hashtag. And so one thing to note, of course, is that you could say, well, this enlarged the movement, but of course it also removed the intimacy of in-person one-on-one disclosure. So Tarana Burke's response to it was, a couple of things. There was panic of like, oh, wow, my whole life's work has just been appropriated without my permission or knowledge. There was that. And then, of course, there was, and it's also being appropriated in a way. She was really concerned about people sitting alone in their bedroom on a phone disclosing without that person there to actually provide support. So it also it didn't just enlarge the movement, it happened in a way that was quite contrary to really what Burke was trying to set up. But as you can read in her autobiographical book Unbound, she dealt with this. She saw that it was happening, she gathered support, and then she took her place within that movement, and it's a central organising place, and it continues to be. So broadly, that is the context. The Me Too movement is associated with a cultural shift from blame to belief. So the idea is that in our culture, our existing culture, when people disclose sexual violence, they tend not to be believed, or there have to be certain traits and things present in order for them to have some purchase on believability. And of course, that's a scenario of injustice. And so the Me Too movement is oriented to shifting from a culture of disbelief to a culture of support. No longer shaming survivors who disclose, and creating a context in which disclosures can lead to proper recognition and redress. Yeah.
So what does it look like to be kind of, I mean, Me Too hasn't gone away. I don't think it will ever go away, but we're almost arguably in like a post-Me Too space because it has evolved since its initiation, right? So what does it look like to be in that kind of post space?
Well, yes, and there's been response, of course, too. So many would locate the public trial of Amber Heard for defamation of Johnny Depp as the, a key moment in the resistance to Me Too, and a key example of how the law of defamation is being used to fight back against this effort to build a culture of believability around survivors instead of the automatic blaming them, blaming and disbelief. And so it's quite it's kind of a war in a sense. Yeah. It's a warlike space, I think, but nonetheless, one can see clearly how the Me Too movement is altering culture. And in fact, the panicked response of the likes of Johnny Depp fans, I think that in itself speaks to a certain knowledge that, yes, there is a massive shift underway culturally, and it's no longer legitimate to have that knee-jerk response of victim blaming.
Okay, so as someone who's a fellow true crime story enthusiast, as well as a lecturer in critical victimology at the university, how do you navigate this space?
Oh, I navigate it by reading and thinking all the time. I'm always prepared to be surprised. I'm always prepared to be learning something new. I think it's a space in which you don't throw your authority around. You kind of, it's really a space of listening. Active listening is what's needed. If we have people disclosing, we must also have people listening. And so that's what I try and do. I try and keep my ear to the ground. One activity that has been very pronounced for me under Me Too, of course, is the visual culture of Me Too. I find I am watching a lot of TV. I'm noticing, for example, even shows like The Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, yeah.
There are, massive Me Too references through the series, through those seasons. There's a kind of shift toward televisual feminism. There are all of these TV and film productions that are very much of the Me Too era. There's She Said, there's I May Destroy You, I have a list here somewhere. Hang on. I'm sure I have a list.
Of course you
here.
have a list. I love it.
Of course I have a list. But the list goes on. Unbelievable. Of course, there's a whole story one could tell about journalism in this time. So many journalists have stepped up to become Me Too journalists. So it's altered the way journalists, TV producers and filmmakers depict and talk about and think about sexual violence. And that's huge cultural, shifting taking place there. I'm finding I'm very media engaged. And
Okay.
I'm fascinated by the new forms that are appearing and the new kinds of stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as you said earlier, and it's no secret, that interest in true crime has risen significantly over the last few years. So what do you think might be contributing to this?
Oh, it's interesting. There's kind of what might be contributing to it? I think a few things are on the rise. There seems to be I think in the Me Too movement, not everybody is committed to a radical politics. I think there are people who have a new consciousness about how crime stories can be covered over through a culture of disbelief and are maybe saying, well, there are new ways to tell these stories and we're going to get out and do that. And so I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but the other thing, of course, is that law enforcement has, at least since the Special Victims Units, has been flattered by media concerning crime.
Yes.
So there's a kind of flattery of law enforcement that happens here too, even in moments where we are criticising and saying police have not, police have been part of the problem of sexual violence, for example. We're not necessarily criticising the criminal justice frame on crime. And so I think there's a kind of shift toward this citizen detective mode. So the citizen detective seems to be somebody who is alert to, say, the key points of Me Too and the way survivors can be cast off by the criminal justice system. And they think they can do law enforcement better than law enforcement can. And so, that figure of the citizen detective who is concerned about crime and who is actually going to investigate it themselves. There are whole communities of citizen detectives in the US, and they have now CrimeCon, right? So they have their own conference where there's like 5,000 people going along every time to meet with iconic writers of true crime and really just feast on true crime. So, I think that citizen detective sensibility is being kind of morphed in different ways and generalised. If I don't know whether you watch Yellow Jackets, but there's
No, but it's on my list.
on your list, right?
Yeah.
So there's a citizen detective character in there.
Okay.
There was recently a kind of, there's a TV show called Dexter.
Yes.
About
yes.
the serial killer who kills serial killers, right?
Yeah.
So there was recently a kind of epilogue almost to that series where we meet Dexter now.
Oh, okay.
Right. And so, of course, there's a true crime podcaster as a character in that. So increasingly we're seeing the citizen who wants to involve themselves in crime investigation, who is bringing to it a kind of consciousness of wanting to rescue those victims and make sure they're looked at, that make sure their crimes are solved. This seems to be part of the push, a sense that crime isn't out there, it's something we can be involved in.
Yeah.
And so The Jinx is, the key example of the true crime documentary that resulted in the conviction of the killer, right? So the documentary makers actually contributed to the investigation, putting this person in prison.
Right.
And then, of course, is Michelle McNamara's I'll Be Gone in the Dark.
Yes.
Right, so a classic example of the true crime thinker, writer who has actually, it's the Golden State Killer, it's an unsolved case, and the work that she does actually contributes to the investigation, his identity being revealed.
Yeah.
And so I think there's this kind of crossover somehow between the citizen and law enforcement taking place, which I think is a little concerning, actually, because it's still happening within that criminal justice frame. So, yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I definitely see what you mean about the kind of, armchair citizen detective and how that's kind of increasing. I mean, we're talking about it now, so it's significant, right? So with the increase in interest in true crime stories, there have, come a couple of things that I've noticed. So one is the commodification of these stories, such as selling merchandise related to the podcasts and the stories themselves, as well as the gendered stereotype that suggests that it's women that like true crime. So what are your thoughts on each of these?
There does seem to be a preponderance of women audiences for true crime. And one of the kind of new things is the insertion of women in this space, which is traditionally male-dominated, that kind of space of law enforcement. And so we are seeing more women involved. And so My Favourite Murder is the classic example of the podcast that kind of fills that space. And what we're seeing, there's a couple of scholars, right, called Megan Hoffman and Simon Hobbs, and they've actually written about their pieces called True Crime in a Post-Me Too World. And they say that with the increased presence of women in true crime podcasting, there are some differences, right? So they say that there's greater focus on victims, a greater focus on incorporating the life story of the victim, interviews with families and friends, instead of the classic true crime format, which is here's our despicable killer and look at this trail of broken bodies. So the broken body cannot speak. So, Hoffman and Hobbs say that with more women being involved, there tends to be a greater interest in the dignity of the victim and holding that person's life story there. There's a centering of the voices of women survivors and their perspectives on what happened. Centering of women's voices more generally as kind of narrators and commentators. And the idea is that they tend to see crime in its social context. So there's a kind of feminist analysis being advanced, as opposed to seeing the offender as this aberrant, this evil person who came from nowhere and no one can understand how this person did these things, the shocking, unbelievable thing. They're saying, actually, these behaviours toward women are normalised, So there's a kind of feminist critique in there. But, of course, what I would say is that, again, we're still working within the criminal justice frame here. So one thing I find interesting is how there's a real focus on serial killers, serial offenders, and a very narrow idea of what might constitute serial offending, So I always like to remind people of what happened 40 years ago in India, right? So there's the chemical factory in Bhopal. And there's an accident at the factory. The factory wasn't safe, and there's an explosion. And almost 4,000 people died instantly, and then 16,000 people in the years after of associated injuries, right?
Right.
So when you've got a chemical company that's killed 20,000 people, maybe that could rate in your true crime podcast, right? Maybe we could give some attention to the activity of corporations.
Yeah.
We're happy to see walking home at night alone as unsafe. We don't see going to work as unsafe. And post Pike River, we shouldn't still be holding that illusion. So I would like to see more attention to corporate crime.
There's actually a lot of that in MFM. In My Favourite Murder, they've started doing that in the more recent seasons.
Nice.
Which is
nice.
Yeah.
I love hearing that.
Yeah.
So what are they looking at? They're looking at
stuff like
American corporates.
Yeah, like, it's not necessarily, this person, followed this person home and took their life, or, this person met this person in a bar, took them in an alley, took their life. It's more like, no, this happened at this factory or this happened at this business. Like they're definitely delving more into that. And they also have a segment where they do hometown stories. So they get people to write in and they might talk about their connection to this true crime story, or this thing happened in my hometown, such as, a disaster at a chemical plant sort of thing.
Yeah, that is awesome, because I wonder how they made that shift, because I feel like initially anyway they were more focused on the traditional crime stories.
Absolutely, yeah.
But one of the things I really like about them, now I'm just thinking, they are Georgia Hardstack and Karen Kilgariff.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I like about them, and this is something about the whole Me Too style podcast space, is their dialogue with their listeners.
Yeah.
And in their book, they write about how they were often getting details wrong.
Yes.
They're like, the killer is 36 and actually they're 42 or something.
Yeah.
And then they would have writers, listeners write into them and go, actually, he's 42. And they always stood corrected. They loved that. They enjoyed the dialogue, and they weren't self-presenting as experts. They were self-presenting as people who were concerned and who were also, these are talented women with fantastic senses of humour, right? So the show was always going to be awesome. But I wonder if their shift to thinking about crimes of the powerful is something that has happened in dialogue with their audience. And if so, that means the genre's working.
Yeah.
That's good. I mean, this is kind of the best news I've had all day,
I'm pleased to be able to share that with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that, because it's a travesty the way, the narrow bandwidth we have when we're thinking about what crime is. And as soon as you break out of that bandwidth, there's a kind of radical critique taking shape in you, and you're seeing things differently. And I think especially in these times when we're looking at climate change is really showing its teeth, right? And it's pretty clear that the corporate irresponsibility that has kind of led us down this path. So I think more and more people need to be realising that. Yeah.
And I mean, MFM is a really, really great example. And I'm just going to preface the next section of this kōrero with I love MFM. They are so funny and so good. But when I mentioned about the commodification of true crime, as someone who listens to MFM, that is the one thing that kind of really irks me, and I have noticed. Like, I'm a subject to the capitalist hellscape that we live in. I love a good piece of merch as much as the next person. But when your podcast starts with ads for several other things, or you get halfway through a sentence and an ad cuts in for HelloFresh, or, there's like, hey, we've got new merch, we've got new merch, we've got new merch. And it's like, okay, that's great. You have to maintain your business. But in 2019, they made a $15 million profit. And I'm like, okay, well done. And I know that they give a lot of money away, but it's like, okay, so what is the kaupapa of your podcast now? Is it to be a business or is it to tell stories? Like, there's no way that those two need to be separated, but I feel like there needs to be a balance. So the commodification of true crime and true crime stories is something that really sticks with me. Doing some reading and research for this episode, one of the things I found was that the Dharma series, which I've not yet finished, but there was significant backlash from the whānaus of the victims because they were not consulted. There was one whānau member that mentioned her entire testimony was recreated in the series and without her consent. Like, you've got to have the kōrero with the people involved if they are still around, right? You can't profit off something without involving the people that, it concerns, right?
I agree with you. And it's that principle of not about us without us.
Yeah.
And true crime is, and also when we think of true crime more expansively, so we've got our staple kind of examples, like the pure examples like the True Crime podcast or the True Crime documentary. But most crime stories that we see on our screens are actually based in some way on a true story. And so there is a kind of ethical looseness built in here where people just think that, no, the victim doesn't own the story, or the families of the victim, they don't own the story. The story is somehow publicly owned. And, just sort of out there. Now, it's interesting because I think Michaela Cole's extraordinary I May Destroy You, which I think of as probably, if I had to say what's the best example of Me Too media, I would say I May Destroy You is the thing.
Okay.
And really what happens there, one of the things that takes place is that we see her struggle to be believed, but we also, because, she's a victim of sexual violence, but we also see her in a kind of different situation where they're very ready to believe her because they can see that her story is going to make a great commodity. So there's an entrepreneurial moment where she is offered these, great things in if she'll tell her story. And I think Michaela Cole has very intelligently kind of taken us through all of the things that someone might face in that space and the new kind of different dilemmas that might visit upon them. And so I May Destroy You is, destroy is an anagram of de-story.
Yes.
So it's all about, she's almost been destroyed by somebody. This person might destroy her. How is she going to go ahead and tell her story around this? And so, and regain her story and regain control and ownership of her story.
Yeah.
So it's like this sort of stuff can happen to you and then the story of it you don't even own. And I think if true crime podcasting and documentary making really needs to brush up its ethics around that, I think you can see I've been watching a few where you can actually see, there's one where, the woman involved is crying and then there's a whole section where the maker talks about his decision to include that footage or not. So there are people in this space who are being very sensitive, but I still think that there is a kind of exploitativeness. And it goes back. The person I like to bring up here is Bertolt Brecht, right?
Yeah.
So he didn't like the way that he was in the talking about the context of the theatre, of course, right? Way back in the last century.
Just going to say, theatre kids tune in now.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a theatre thing. But he was like, stories of suffering are, used to shock in the theatre. The penny dreadful, right?
Yes.
He was really critical of the penny dreadful because he's like, well, what really is happening here? What seems to be happening is that we are experiencing kind of the shock of this story, then we're kind of horrified, and then in expression of horror, we're experiencing ourselves as virtuous.
Yeah.
We're the good people because we're horrified by this story.
Yeah.
And Brecht thought that the road that we're taken off there is the road of critical thinking, of looking at the society and thinking, well, how could this have happened? And thinking about other instances of these forms of harm and who else might be, whose forms of harm are visible to us and what forms of harm aren't visible. So Brecht was about creating theatre that inspired people to do critical thinking, not to be shocked and then ultimately really experience themselves as virtuous. So I think true crime podcasting can go either way. It can stimulate critical thinking, or it can just be on that loop of, isn't this terrible and aren't you a good person because you've shed a tear here for this victim? I think that's a kind of sterile space, and a meaningless exchange is taking place there. We want critical thinking.
Absolutely. So, as I've mentioned, there's a stereotype that abounds surrounding consumption of true crime. And in my research, I've come across a few explanations for this that I just want to korero about. So one is that women are more empathetic to both victim and perpetrator. True crime stories are a form of education on how to protect yourself and maybe escape a situation. And the third one is a way of highlighting warning signs for potential dangerous situations. So these are the three kind of suggested reasons for the gendered consumption of true crime. So what do you think about those? Have you heard of those before?
They kind of sound very much in the ballpark of the kind of criminal justice frame, that one would tune into these stories so that one might learn things that one can employ in future. I know there's this film called Copycat from the 90s, and Sigourney Weaver plays the psychologist who has mastered the understanding of serial killers. And we see her going to university campuses and giving talks, and she'll be signing a book, and then there's this moment in the film where she says to the young woman, "Don't park next to vans."
Yeah.
Right. So the way to avoid a serial killer is to not park next to a van. And so I do think this, the criminologists and victimologists refer to this as fear of crime. That keeping us in a space where we're quite fearful of crime and of one another, and where we are engaged ongoingly in safekeeping practices. And when we do this, we think of ourselves as good citizens. This, I think, goes with the sensibilities of law enforcement. Again, we're not seeing going to work as dangerous.
Yeah.
There are things that we're prepared to see as risky, and other things that are risky that we're not seeing as risky, or we're not talking about as risky.
Yeah.
So I agree, though, that they will be the draw cards. The idea that if I learn about these things, I'll be able to get tips for avoiding them, or being able to read the play a little better.
Yeah.
And really that's the neoliberal citizen, right? We're meant to be risk averse.
Yeah.
We're meant to assume personal responsibility for our safety. And if it all goes wrong, it's our fault, right? So there is a kind of an undertow of victim blaming in a lot of those practices.
Yeah.
So while if I thought that someone ought to avoid parking next to vans, maybe I would pass that advice on. But if they parked next to a van and got nabbed by a serial killer, I'm not going to blame them.
No.
The reason wasn't where they parked.
Yeah.
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 So, yeah.
But it's interesting, that nuance, isn't it? Because, again, going back to MFM, they have a bunch of little catchphrases that are kind of advice like that. Like one of them is fuck politeness sort of thing. So the kind of premise behind that is like you see someone that might be struggling on the side of the road and they, flag you down in your car and they want your help, aka Ted Bundy. No, don't be polite, carry on, because you won't be putting yourself in that dangerous situation. And so it's very nuanced, and it is like kind of a grey area, because it's like, well, on the one hand, that's not necessarily the world's worst advice, but on the other hand, it's like you're taking responsibility for yourself, which to a degree you should. But if you get murdered or you get injured or hurt in any way, it's not your fault. It's never your fault. It's always the person that did it.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think immediately of the wise and wonderful Belle Murphy, who here in Otipoti, she does self-defence.
I've taken one of her classes.
Right, me too.
Yeah.
Me too. And so I think of the line, she talks about how, in kind of feminist self-defence work, there's a line that they tread, here are the things that you can do to, break this kind of hold or get out of that kind of situation or assert yourself against someone who's doing these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But if you don't do those things, it isn't your fault.
Yes.
So there is this, conscious, open dialogue about victim blaming and saying, we're not here to victim blame you, but there will be empowering things that you learn here about keeping yourself safe on the daily.
Yeah.
So I think there's that feminist self-defense seems to be the place where those things are held together, and the paradox of that is talked about, thus sort of dispelling the problems associated with it. I think there's a real wisdom around how to do this in that space. And so I think the fuck politeness idea, I think that's a terrific idea. Because, I can think of many situations I ended up in because I just couldn't bring myself to be rude.
Yeah.
And so I remember, in Belle's workshop, we're to put someone sitting next to us is to put their hand on our leg, and we're to find our voice and saying, get your hand off my leg. In that moment, I remembered all the times when I wasn't able to voice myself that way.
Yeah.
And so I felt that empowerment, and I affirm that,
Yeah.
I think that is a really cool thing. So their fuck politeness message is really awesome.
Uh-huh.
But again, that's kind of popular feminism. It's something that feminists have been sort of saying since the 70s. So
Yeah.
I also think there's a good bit of catching up going on maybe.
Yeah,
you know?
maybe. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, anything that gets us to kind of like deprogram that, programming we have. It's like, no, you have to be, polite and demure and always help, because that's, as women, that's who we are. It's like, that might be a part of it, but that's not our whole identity, and that's not necessarily the same for everyone. You can't put us all in one box. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's an intensely racialised and classed identity. It's bourgeois manners.
Yeah.
And so if we're not in the categories that refers to, we're thought about as violent and as aggressive and this, that and the other. And so there's no sort of blanket rule that, everybody sees women as needing to be polite or as naturally polite or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think many of us, we people, could kind of unlearn some politeness. I think politeness has a lot to answer for in these spaces. And so self-assertion is, the art of asserting oneself is something one has to grapple with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, anyone that's empowered to set their own boundaries, find their own voice, stand up for themselves, however you do it, it's always a win. Yeah.
Yeah.
So another thing that I've noticed is the impact that media plays on the consumption of true crime. It's really only, the sexy stories about victims or survivors that will sell, that get the most airtime. So I want to unpick this a little, as it highlights the intersectionality, or lack thereof, of true crime consumption and reporting. So what are your experiences with this? Have you noticed any trends in the way that crime is reported or discussed, and which stories get told?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
How long have we got?
Oh, yeah. We are so sutured into a very particular, I call it parameters of recognition. Mm-hmm. And the theorist on this is Nils Christie. Mm-hmm. So he wrote this piece back in the 80s called The Ideal Victim, saying, in order to be kind of, the point here is that the severity of what happens to you isn't what's going to determine. So you go, it was really bad what happened to this person. That's not going to determine whether they're visible or their story is tellable or not. Mm-hmm. What's going to determine it is whether they align with who we think of as the ideal victim. So do they tick those boxes or don't they? And, of course, the criteria of ideal victimhood shifts around. One of the things Christie says is that the ideal victim is somebody who can't be blamed for being where they were when the crime took place. Someone who is respectable, going about a respectable project. His example is, the little old lady who is, beaten up in broad daylight. She's coming back from caring for her sick sister, and the dangerous man coming from far away comes along and mugs her. And not only that, uses the money to buy alcohol or drugs. So he also says that we have an ideal victim. The more ideal the offender is, the more ideal the victim is. So we have this really narrow criteria. Where I differ from Christie is this idea that somehow all women are automatically recognised as victims and that the ideal victim is this feminine figure. I actually have a real quarrel with that. Mm-hmm. I think we have very robust discourses in culture of men as victims. I think we saw them at work when Johnny Depp took Amber Heard to court in Virginia. Mm-hmm. And so I do think we have very strong discourses of men as victims. And I also think that our discourses of feminine victimisation just don't land evenly on women. There are certain women... we're talking, it's all of the usual things. It's heteronormative, it's cisgender normative, it's whiteness, right? These sort of elements of one's identity are going to promote you to the kind of greatest visibility. And we have, many forms of victimisation and victims who are just routinely ignored. So really the scope for topics in true crime podcasts, it would be great if less visible victims were looked at, and thought about in ethical ways. So not just by appropriating the story. So, I hope that answers what you were thinking of. But, it's very limited who we're prepared to see as a victim. And also the other thing I would add is that ideal victims don't have a great time. So even if you get the cultural reward, if you like, of being recognised as an ideal victim, you're always at threat of losing that status.
Yes.
And you really have to cooperate with, if you're an angry victim, if you want to kind of criticise the investigation, if you want to speak out, if you want to speak about things differently, you'll probably get dropped from that position. So it's not a secure status. Yeah, we're not very good at responding to victimisation, generally.
But I mean, the flip side to that as well is if, you find yourself a victim of whatever scope of crime and, you find yourself cast in the public eye because your story is being told, not only have you got to survive and process this thing that's happened to you, you now have to do it potentially with a significant public scrutiny. Yeah. And that isn't fair. So, I mean, how do you navigate and balance okay, this thing has happened. You can argue that it's important that the story gets told because, myriad reasons. But how do you do that while respecting the people that it involves? Is it even possible to do it? How do you balance truth and privacy, I guess?
Well, sometimes these matters are very practical. Like, for example, Natasha Kampusch, right? So she was abducted at the age of 8 and then at the age of 18. Sorry, at the age of 10 she was abducted and then at the age of 18 she escaped. And her story was very famous across the world and they wanted to make a movie out of it, right? So initially she was working with this director who was really wanting to go somewhere with this story, who was working with her. They'd agreed that there would be no rape scene. They agreed that there was a higher purpose to the telling and it was going to be quite an arty film reflecting on her experience. He died. The production, unexpectedly, the production elected a new director. And mixing my words there. And Natasha was taken out, she wasn't consulted. They did a rape scene against her wishes. She did a set visit and just kind of came upon the guy who was cast to play the guy who abducted her when she was 10. She's like, oh, hi, I'm Natasha. And he's like, oh, hi, I'm playing Wolfgang. And she said it was terribly awkward. She writes about this in her book, 10 Years of Freedom. It was terribly awkward. The actors did not know what to do with themselves when she showed up onto the set. There hadn't been proper communication going, Natasha's visiting today, folks.
Yeah.
She goes to the premiere. She's sitting with, like a lot of dozens and dozens of film industry people and actors and stuff. She slips out quietly because she could no longer bear to watch them all sitting together watching this reenactment of what had happened to her that she hadn't been properly consulted on.
Yeah.
So, compare that with, I happen to know that when Philly de Lacy made Heather Walsh's story into a production, Heather's not crazy about the title. It's called Monster of Mangatiti. But Heather's set visits were, really carefully organised. Boy, did they look after her, and she felt looked after. They were like, oh, hang on, we can't just go ahead and have her visit the set. We need to, there were conversations, there were preparation of the actors, there was just such care taken with her story and her as the person whose story was being told. So they're very contrasting experiences. So I would say there are practical matters here to do with involving somebody in the telling of their story. Yeah. And I'm hoping that we're moving toward a space where it kind of becomes unthinkable to not do that. That's what I'm hoping.
Yes. We can be optimistic, right?
Right, we can. And, at the end of the day, we have to be, right? So,
yeah. Absolutely. So going back to what I was saying about intersectionality or lack thereof and the reporting of the stories, have you noticed that in any of the New Zealand stories that you may have followed or read about?
Oh, look, I don't have examples springing to mind. I do remember that some of the examples I think of, I sort of engaged with something that Peter Sharples, it was initially a talk and then a paper wrote years ago about Māori and victim and how there seems to be this media and governmental unwillingness to recognise Māori victimisation through crime, but also victimisation through colonisation. So there is that kind of push back against the truth, this idea of, okay, the Treaty of Waitangi, great, let's finish business and close it. There is this unwillingness to acknowledge the treaty as the founding document of the nation, as a living document. There is a kind of unwillingness to frame colonisation as a form of victimisation. So I would say those things haunt depictions of Māori in victimisation in media. And so what you end up with isn't the same as when they're discussing Pākehā matters. Yeah. So I think there are differences. I can't really be more systematic than that, but I would definitely encourage people to listen out for it because it is there. And people engaged in the telling of these stories need to kind of think into that and alter what they're prioritising and how they're telling stories, mindful that there is this sort of undertow of almost in a kind of aggressive resistance to acknowledging Māori victimisation. Yeah. That's what I've noticed. Yeah. I can't say I've been systematic in the study of it, but I noticed that culturally.
Yeah. It's you've got to tell your stories like through an intersectional lens, right? You have to consider all of the things.
And also, stop being so kind of ready to tell stories of lateral violence. So it feels like the media is really happy to talk about violence where it's lateral, as in, in Australia, the Northern Territory intervention, the concept there was Aboriginal people are destroying each other. And we need to go in and rescue the children. So there's almost a gratitude for being able to speak about violence within Aboriginal communities. So there could be something similar here in Aotearoa. I feel like I've seen it, but again, I haven't studied it systematically, not like the way I have vis-a-vis Australia, Because in Australia, there's definitely a media interest in lateral violence. If the perpetrator and the victim are Aboriginal, it's like, oh yeah, great, we can run with this story.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's a complete unwillingness to cover in any real way racist violence, racially motivated violence, and also violence that really has taken its where the differential power is key to what's happened. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're the kinds of things we watch for, the appetite for lateral violence, but not so much interest in sort of racially motivated violence.
Yeah.
Or violence motivated by racism, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So to sum it all up, what, in your opinion, is good about our love of true crime? Is it important for us to consume this content and continue to tell the stories of survivors and victims?
Yeah, I'm certainly not against true crime. I'm definitely, in fact, one of the origin points for true crime is, of course, the Leopold and Loeb story. You know?
Yeah.
Maya Levin was so horrified by where Hitchcock went with Rope
Yeah.
that he writes his, documentary novel about the case, saying, no, we need to really take the facts in here. We need to look at the wider story. We need to understand these people better. We need to look at what they went through after that was discovered, because there was anti-Semitic racism, there was homophobia. So Maya Levin was kind of like, I'm going to write compulsion in order to correct the terrible telling of this crime. So then Truman Capote uses that as one of his sources of inspiration. He writes in Cold Blood, which really exposes the way we're happy for people of lower socioeconomic class to hang for their crimes. But as it says later in the book, the rich never hang.
Yeah.
Right? So he was really wanting to expose that inequality. So true crime can do great things. It can really change the way we perceive crime and criminality. But yeah, nothing's perfect, right?
No.
So I say focus on the strengths, focus on the capacity of the medium to kind of lift the lid on the conventional ways in which we tell and consume crime stories. That's the power, I reckon.
Yeah. Beautiful. I agree. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. It
Thank
was
you.
awesome to talk to you, as always.
Wonderful to talk to you. Thanks so much.
The Rainbow Umbrella is kindly sponsored by the Aurora Cafe in Mosgiel. The Rainbow Umbrella theme song is by Paul S. Allen and Beth. Check them out on Spotify. New episodes of The Rainbow Umbrella are available every fourth Thursday on Otago Access Radio 105.4 FM, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. Do you have an idea for an episode or something you would like to kōrero about? Get in touch at rainbowumbrellapod@gmail.com.